the Europe we voted to leave, that he voted to stay in 2016, is very different from the Europe that we're now in. The populist right is now in charge of Italy, of Holland, of Hungary, and it looks now of France. That's very different, and a different Europe to deal with for Britain.
Round one of polling is finished for France's snap parliamentary election. Jane Garvey was doing some important investigative journalism there only yesterday. The Eurosceptic right-wing National Rally Party is ahead, but it's all to play for. The second round comes on Sunday. To give us an idea of what is coming, we're joined by CNN's Europe editor, Nina dos Santos. Morning, Nina.
Good morning. Hi, Sting.
So I guess the question is, can this National Rally get a majority such that they can form the government? Because it's hard to think who they'll go into coalition with. But the prospects of a deeply hung parliament is very difficult for France to handle. What are the various options, do you think, in the week ahead?
Well, the scenarios that everybody's looking at this point is, as you pointed out, will the National Rally get a majority based on the fact that they clinched between 34 and 33% of the votes, triumphing in this first round of voting? It's looking as though they're on track to get about maximum 280 seats in the 577 strong lower House of Parliament in France, the Assemblée Nationale. That means they'd be 9 seats short of an absolute majority. And they've said that they don't want to govern without an absolute majority. So it's a real nail biter here, whether or not they can cobble together some support from elsewhere. Marine Le Pen's already been out in the last few hours reminding voters, she says, it's not done. Do come out for me in support for the next second round. But as we know, French voters very often vote rather differently in the second round to how they vote in the first round. What we're also seeing is a strong performance for the left parties that have managed to ally in a very sort of uncomfortable alliance because they have very different views on very different things. They clinched about 28 to 29% of the vote. And what we're seeing is people like François Hollande, the famously unpopular left-wing former president of France, coming back from political sidelines here to say, well, look, the left, centre right, whoever it is, centrist Macronists, you have to come together, stand down candidates so that we can try and block the ascent of the far right on the second round. That is looking rather tricky to organise, considering as they have to field candidates by tomorrow and there's only a few hours left of horse trading stake.
And also, presumably, Nina, the problem there is that left coalition includes actual communists. So the question is, can the Macronists ally with the communists to stop the far right? Would that be a coalition that works? The centre and the left have to gather together. Would they be willing to do that?
Looking very, very unstable here because obviously elements of the far left have all sorts of deeply divisive policies, like, for instance, Jean-Luc Mélenchon wanting to immediately recognise a Palestinian state, as he says. Other people on the left, more moderate centrists, don't agree with that type of very incendiary international geopolitics, particularly from an important G7 member like France. They also want to raise the minimum wage by 14% and spend about 150 billion euros in state spending straight away and repeal Emmanuel Macron's crucial retirement reform that he really rammed through Parliament. That was raising the retirement age by 4 years from 60 to 64. It seems very unlikely that Macron would allow them to push back on all of his agenda. But the other option that he has is a cohabitation government with a far right that is after the presidency in 2027 and will use this premiership as a bully pulpit to fight him tooth and nail on the domestic agenda.
God, it's interesting, and it's really unclear how this will all settle. We'll keep analysing it as it goes. Nina, great to speak to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
That's Nina dos Santos, CNN's Europe editor. Who is the star of the election? It says here Andrew Neil, who has his brilliant Times Radio programme every day this week at 1 o'clock. That's good of you, Andrew. You come on this programme, you give us your wisdom, you do your own show, and you write our scripts as well. You are truly a polymath.
It's multitasking.
You are a Renaissance man of Times Radio. France, do you want to explain France for us as a nation, as a political animal?
Yeah, I mean, I watched the England match for 10 minutes last night and then went back to the French elections because they were more interesting.
That's true.
And it was more exciting. I think a number of the French elections are very significant, in some ways more significant than our own. I think a number of things follow from it. I think we know Marine Le Pen's party is now going to be the largest party in the National Assembly. What we don't yet know, and we won't know till next Sunday night, is it going to have a majority? And therefore President Macron has to ask it to form a government. That bit we don't know. We know it's probably quite good news for Britain in a way, because provided Mr. Starmer doesn't screw things up, Britain, after all the business of Brexit, Britain's now looking a bit like an island of stability. That we're going to move from a centre-right government to a centre-left government. There's not going to be any riots, demonstrations. There's not going to be a victory for the far right or the far left. It'll all happen within the centre. That's good. Could be good for investment, good for interest rates, and good for sterling. I think the second thing is that Mr. Starmer also has to be careful. What you saw in France yesterday was the failure of centrism. Yeah. And Keir Starmer represents broadly the same kind of centrism as President Macron. And if that doesn't deliver, as the French people don't think it has delivered, the consequences are not great, because the two big victors yesterday were the far right, or the populist right, and the far left, dominated by Corbynistas and communists. So that's a danger down the road as well. And I think that the third thing that is relevant to a Starmer government is that the Europe we voted to leave, that he voted to stay in 2016, is very different from the Europe that we're now in. The populist right is now in charge of Italy, of Holland, of Hungary, and it looks now of France. That's very different, and a different Europe to deal with for Britain.
Do you think this would give, we had Nigel Farage on our programme earlier, Andrew, does he act as a sort of threat then to both the Conservative Party and potentially even Keir Starmer's government further down the right line? Because there's something of the national rally about reform, and therefore if things don't go well from a centrist perspective, you can see the path to him having even more influence.
Yeah, that would be my fourth point, actually. It has big implications for the Conservatives as they seek to rebuild themselves after what is probably going to be a historic defeat on Thursday. How do they do that without embracing the populist right, which in Britain is represented by Nigel Farage and Reform?